Well, good afternoon, everyone. Before we start, if you are on Zoom, welcome. If you would put in the chat area your name and your company and the role that you play. If you're here in the room, if you'd introduce yourself to some others in the room, feel free to trade business cards if you would like, and we'll start in just 1 minute.
Doing great. Back into town last night.
My parents thought this would be like, yeah, 100 years ago we'll go. And the ultimate part, it has your clouds. I've looked, it looks to have a second cat like it, but I can't find it.
They have the.
Well, welcome to Ask the Experts. This is the Tri-City Regional Chamber of Commerce's series to help business leaders grow their companies with practical advice and answers that you can implement right away. Special welcome to those that are watching on Zoom remotely. You're a valuable part of our audience today. My name is Paul Casey of Growing Forward Services. I do leadership coaching and training, and it's my pleasure to be your facilitator here today. This is a free benefit of your chamber membership, and it couldn't be possible without the generous sponsorship of STCU. With us today again is Sarah. Sarah, come on up here if you want to say a word or two. Welcome, everyone.
I always feel like I'm coming down for a game show.
I know. Spin the wheel.
Hey, no, we just want to say welcome and thank you for being here. We appreciate it. Consider it a real privilege to sponsor this. We're an organization founded by educators, so education at every level is really important to us. So enjoy.
Yes. Thank you again. And we're grateful for your support of Ask the Experts. So for approximately half of our 90 minutes together, our experts will be presenting their gold nuggets on our topic of key performance indicators, expectations for team accountability. And for the second half, then they're going to answer your questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, and we do encourage everyone here, whether you're on Zoom or in the room, to think of one question to ask. Okay, so if you're an introvert, I'm giving you a warning, 45-minute warning here. If you would text me at 50, can we get that slide up there? So you're gonna text me at 509-392-1895. Probably want to write that down because we're gonna lose that slide here in a minute. But 509-392-1895, whether you're on Zoom or you're here in the room, that keeps the questions anonymous. And I will be vetting those questions, and then I'll feed them to the experts in that second half. And we'll get to as many of the questions as possible in our time. And if you'd like to contact them afterward, we'll share, if you guys maybe share how they can contact you afterward, that would be great for any follow-up. So let me introduce our speakers today. Over here on my right is Erich Bolz. His educational career spans over 25 years in public education as a remedial reading teacher, pre-K through 12 principal, central office administrator, both in small, large, and educational service district levels, an adjunct professor at Heritage University, got my master's there, yes, and 2013 recipient of the Violet Lumley Rao Alumni Outstanding Alumnus Award. He's a board member at Communities and Schools of Benton Franklin and Partners for Early Learning, serving Tri-Cities, Washington. He's also great at informing and executive strategic planning, facilitating process improvement discussions using compression planning methodology, and he's been a TEDx speaker. So that's pretty cool too. And over here we've got Tom Walther. At the age of 30, Tom became president of a $20 million distribution business. After 18 years changing industries, he then became president of an engineering company focused on process automation in the food manufacturing industry. Tom was the driving force behind converting that company into an employee-owned company through an employee stock ownership program. After 21 years there, he hired a successor and retired. Tom joined the Gideons International in 2004, an association of Christian business and professional men and their wives. He has held many leadership positions at both the local and state levels. And in 2017, he started a C12 Business Forum in Madison, Wisconsin, an organization of Christian CEOs, presidents, and business owner peer groups. In 2019, he moved to Kennewick to bring C12 to the Inland Northwest region. Tom has been married to his high school sweetheart, Bev, for over 47 years. impressive, has 2 children and 9 grandchildren. Let's welcome our speakers today. Take it away, gentlemen.
Well, thank you very much for having us, and I won't speak on behalf of Tom, at least not very much, but you know, when Paul read that, it sounds really impressive, but I think the bottom line is, you know, I'm 55, so there's a lot of things on a resume. If you've been around a while, it really has probably more to do with longevity than skill set or anything like that. I left Pasco schools in 2020. I worked for a company out of Bellevue called the Center for Educational Effectiveness. I serve in the role of Vice President of Research and District Engagement, which means we look at all kinds of data sets. We generate all kinds of data sets for folks, primarily in the K-12, some in the university sector, a little bit in the nonprofit, and a little bit less even in business. And we really focus on how do we help schools and other organizations improve their culture, how we help leaders improve their skills. So was really excited to get matched up with Tom. We've had a couple of great discussions. I learned a ton from Tom, and since I've only been in the business world for 3 years, I feel like I'm constantly learning all the time. And I think the thing that was the biggest analogy, the biggest takeaway for me was, boy, in terms of tracking key performance indicators and how maybe not organized systems are in general, there's an awful lot of overlap in business and education. We have obviously different lagging indicators, but a lot of the processes that we can and should have in place really should be the same. So Tom, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself, and then we'll go with a little table discussion. And
yeah, I'm just thrilled to be here and have an opportunity to speak with you. And we've been chatting back and forth a little bit between KPIs, and I can tell you that one of the questions that I often get is, well, what KPI should I be looking at? So we wanted to start with that because it's relatively easy, although there are people that have been tracking them for quite a long period of time and still wondering, am I doing the right one? So with that, Eric's going to kick it off with a couple questions to maybe get a little dialogue going on here and prompt maybe some thinking in that line.
absolutely, and we think it's not only fun, we actually process information better if we have the opportunity to kind of turn heads inward about every 10 minutes or so. So I'll try to pepper this with a question here and there as we go. But really, to get started, if you just look at slides 2 and 3 in your notes, and feel free to just have a short chat with the folks around you. Really, 2 critical questions to take a look at. First one being, what area of your business has the strongest metrics for informing your leadership and decision making? And then the next question right below, it's really kind of the converse, and that one is, which areas do you struggle with crafting and tracking quantified objectives and KPIs? So go ahead and have that discussion at your tables. What do we think we're doing really well in this regard? What do we think we have the opportunity to maybe grow on a bit?
And when you think about that, we kind of broke it up into some additional categories there, as well as thinking about things from your own revenue generation perspective, from an operations perspective, from financial management, or organizational development. And just maybe as you're sitting there thinking right now of strong areas that you might have, does anybody feel like they've got at least a good handle on a few or one of those, a couple of those areas?
I think I'm not tied into, well, I imagine we're supposed to be talking.
Talk away.
Yeah, anybody feel really good about any of them that you have right now?
Operations are getting better than they were.
Organized, very good. For myself and that.
Yeah. Well, for us, we can't speak to anybody else, but I'm outside of the financial management side for my role in our business, so I can't speak to that. Operations, we've done a couple things that, so this year we started tracking on-time deliveries, which I think is a big important part of how you're doing in operations. The thing that jumps out to me right away is as an area that we need to work on is organizational development.
Okay.
It's where we want to be in the future and how we want to get there.
Good. Yeah, in fact, why don't you think about it from that end as well? If you don't feel like you've got strong in any one area, is there a particular area that you are especially interested in? How do we get a handle on that? And that, I'll just advance the slide there to the second question there, but anybody struggling in a particular area, just so we get a little bit of sense of the room and what you're dealing with right now. How many would raise your hand and say, we've got a good idea, but we're always looking to do better? Anybody in that category?
Well, I'm always in that category.
Okay.
Me too.
Yeah, I just think that's part of your, I'm the type of person in the evening, I think about my day. What were my conversations like? Were they strong conversations? How confident was I? Sorry, it sounds all about me, but I am in sales and I'm a consultant. So, I have to project myself to potential clients. So I think about those things and I want to make sure that I'm coming over very clear and concise and able to deliver the services that I can provide to them. So I constantly critique myself.
Good. Yeah.
I want to speak for a second, Eric, just so that you know, I'm with Liberty Christian Schools. When I perked up a lot when I heard about education
Oh, there you go.
on that, but we're in a situation where we're out of room. We've scaled up, and so our enrollment metrics, our financial metrics, and those are pretty solid right now. But it's really the people growth and adjusting the culture to that scale that is something we really need to hone in on as we move forward.
Love to talk to you more about that, but sounds like a lot of organizational development.
Well, let's kind of dig into a little bit more on that side. There we go. So one of the critical things that we wanted to share was what is a KPI in the first place? Key performance indicator, but to recognize that they're tied to an objective. So that you're typically looking at something that you want to get accomplished. And the objective is defining what it is that you want to achieve. And the KPI itself is the measure of that. And so a lot of times people will just start thinking of random metrics to start looking at and tracking. And that's one way to do it. And if you don't have anything, it's better than nothing. But one of the things that we wanted to share a little bit with is a little bit more thinking behind, how do I know I have the right ones? And so I have a little graphic up here that we use with our companies to help them think of the process and the approach. And one of the critical parts starting at the top is, really having a defined mission, vision, and values, because that really helps drive your strategic planning. And while a lot of companies might have parts of that, they don't always spend maybe as much time as they really should. And I'm going to deviate just a little bit, but for example, values. A lot of times companies will come up with some values that are important to them, put them on the wall, and that's about as far as it ever gets. And we really want to encourage that your values really means something. In fact, we have, some of my clients have taken the approach of, we hire based on values. We train for our values, and developing that. We promote based on our values, and we'll terminate on our values. And so if you haven't really thought through that and haven't given that a lot of thought, it's really critical in developing where you're going to go, what you're going to do. And as that gets developed, typically we encourage to have, an annual primary goal, something major. And a good way to think about that would be to think about what the headline for your organization will be on December 31st at the end of the year. What's the thing that you'd want to have being said about your organization as a headline that helps give you a focal point? And then from there, you start thinking about, well, what are the different things that we're going to have to do in order to be able to accomplish that headline. And we usually recommend breaking it out into the different components that we have there listed as revenue generation, operations, financial management, organizational development. In our world, we also add in the that ministry or caring for people category as well. But what are some critical objectives that you'd want to get accomplished in order to be able to achieve that overriding primary goal that you'd like to have at the end of the year? And so thinking through that a little bit more specifically helps to solidify your mind and the objectives. And there might be multiple objectives. We're going to talk about that here in just a second. But it's once those objectives are set that you're thinking about well, how will I measure it? You've probably heard about SMART goals, and SMART being specific, measurable, attainable,
Timely and relevant.
irrelevant and timely. Thank you. And usually the catch one is when I'm having people think about, their goals. It's that measure one that is always the toughest. And the one question that I've always used for people is, okay, you've got a goal. I want to improve our communications in the company. Okay, that's our goal. We're going to improve communications. The question that needs to be asked is, how will you know if you've accomplished it? What are you going to use to measure whether or not you've actually accomplished it or not? It doesn't matter what goal it is. If you can't answer how are we going to measure it, you're missing that important component. And so as you are thinking about those different objectives, now you can start to put in the KPIs, the measures that we're going to use to actually determine whether we get those or not. And then from there, you're developing an action plan to develop that. So, for example, here, helping to identify the critical KPIs and knowing the right ones. And we'll just kind of go through in some of the orders here. These next several slides are designed to help provide some questions that you might ask about your organization of how well you're doing in that particular area. And sometimes it may create, hey, there's an objective there that we need to work on that we haven't been doing anything with. So identifying some of the first ones here would be, first just look at your mission, vision, values and ask yourself, can your employees recite them even? How many feel really good about that if your company, or somebody was asking the company your mission, vision, values, that they could recite it? Anybody? One? Okay, good. Would tell you that they bought into it. What do you think?
Their performance, their presence.
Okay,
Engagement.
okay. What else? What else might tell you whether or not they have or haven't?
Customer satisfaction.
Yeah,
Big
I
piece of it.
could use that,
Feedback that we get.
right?
Seems like it depends mostly on what they are. It's kind of hard to say how we measure it if we don't know, if you don't have it defined ahead of time. Right, if my values are, like, to go back to what we said before, on-time deliveries, right? My value is delivering to my customer exactly what I say I'm gonna deliver when I say I'm gonna deliver it. That's the value, right? Then I can measure that. Are my guys delivering exactly what we say to the customer when they say it? Well, it's a different thing than if my value is something, say I'm in a different industry, my value is something totally different.
Good.
I like what was said here, though, engagement, right? So regardless of the organization, how do we know our folks are engaged, maximizing, giving it their all because they really buy into what it is we do?
Mhm.
So one of the things that I used to do with our leadership team is we'd meet every day for just 5 minutes, a quick stand-up meeting. Hey, what do you got hot on your plate today? Who are you gonna be talking with? Invariably, somebody would say, oh, I'm gonna be visiting with this client, and somebody else in the room would go, I've been trying to get a hold of them for a while, and just the fact that they knew that the other one was gonna be talking that day was a good thing. But one of the things we used to do is ask them, okay, who can recite our values in the company? And I'd already taken them off the wall, so you couldn't see. And in the beginning, everybody was kind of, well, we were lucky if we could go around the room and get them all 6 of ours. And but eventually they started, getting to a point where they could, pretty well rattle them off and everybody knew them. And then the next question was, who did you find, or did you find anybody living out one of these values yesterday? Did you find anybody, as a good example? And that became kind of a exercise that we had. It was, all right, now that we've got them, let's go out and find people doing it and celebrate it. And that's one way you can start working towards that question. Our decisions are made using our mission statement as an arbiter. That's one thing a good mission statement will do. It will not only tell where you're going as an organization, but it'll also tell where you're not going to go. And that can often be one of the most important items you have. Steve Jobs used to say the hardest part for Apple is not coming up with new products, is deciding which ones we're not going to work on. And because that was not the issue. And then when you finally do get it, you zone in on that. So that's kind of on the mission statement. So here's some examples that we might have relative to on the revenue side. Essentially, if our strategic objective is to grow our business by 20%, we might want to create some objectives. Well, how are we going to do that? What are we going to do that specifically? So in this particular case, they came up with 3 different areas. We want to grow our international sales by a certain amount. We want to grow our product, whatever, sales to a certain amount. We want to grow our online sales to a certain amount. These are 3 different things, 3 different objectives that we're going to work on to cumulatively improve our sales by 20%. Now that you have the objectives, you can attach the KPIs, the key performance indicators, that you would use to track them, and have those kind of listed there as well. But you can see how they're tied specifically to an objective, as opposed to just some random, well, this is what I think, we ought to track, or, whatever, or not having any tie back to it at all. And so that's, one example.
If I can just interject there real quick, and I think this is an absolutely brilliant slide, and I'm saying that because Tom put it together, I didn't. But I really like the order of it, and in doing strategic planning with lots of organizations, I have 5 going right now. I think starting at the top with this broad strategic objective, then identifying the strategies or tactics underneath. What are we going to do then more discreetly to make sure that we do that? And then picking the KPIs last. I think one of the things Tom did such a nice job of framing right up front was, how do you get to your KPIs? I think the way this is ordered, the KPIs really ultimately reveal themselves after you pick the broad objective, you pick the strategies and tactics underneath the objective, and then you ask the question, well, how are we going to measure it? So I just wanted to call out that I think this slide was incredibly well organized. And the KPIs, I think, generally reveal themselves last in the process, once you're really mission clear on what those bigger broad strategies, and then ultimately strategies and tactics are underneath each of those broad ones.
Great summary there. So, oops, I'm getting further ahead there because I was looking at your screen and that doesn't move. Okay, another objective was to keep our project management current. So in this particular company, they worked on a lot of different projects. That was how they made their money, which was working and servicing projects, but they weren't always necessarily keeping them current. And so that was the objective. We've got to work on that. This is a true story with an individual, a firm that was kind of struggling in that area. And so their objective was, we're going to start making sure that each month our projects are updated and by each project manager, and we're going to commit to making that happen. So one of their KPIs, or several of the KPIs that came from that, is we're going to be able to show everybody in the meeting the project cost and versus what the budget was compared to that. And you can see the other KPIs there, the time elapsed, and those were all some different measures that we would use to be able to track that. And I can tell you, in this particular organization, last year, that was a big problem for them. And they kind of just simply walked through some of these objectives, nailed those down, and then each month now they're they're reporting happily, they're reporting that they're actually getting them done and seeing some really good results from that. So one of the critical things then is to think about these different categories in your organization. And here are some questions. You have your printout there as well. It's a little bit hard to read on the printout. But the idea behind these questions is in revenue generation, and that can mean anything relative to customers, customer service, the marketing side, anything to do with bringing income into your organization. And here are just some questions to think through that might trigger, how well are we doing in these different areas on a scale of 1 to 10? And obviously anything that you find that's on the low category would be, all right, what do we have to do to shore that up? Just curious, as you look through the list there on those particular questions, any of them kind of raise a flag in your mind, maybe of something you're doing or not doing that you might be as a result of looking at those questions? Any one particular question that strikes you?
Feel like I'm answering all the questions, so.
Well, go ahead. Is there one that stands out for you?
Well, the first thing that I think you should, we include customers in the strategic process to identify how we can better serve them. I think that's important, but even before that, when you're doing your internal process, you should ask yourself, if I ask the customer, then this is my thought, correct me if I'm wrong, but if I ask the customer what I can do better for them, do I already know what they're gonna say? Right, and if I already know what they're gonna say, then that's the first thing I need to work on, right? That just is what jumps out into my head reading that one,
Okay.
so.
Well, and surveys, what we're gonna talk about a little bit, is one way to get that feedback, to find out, is that true? And a lot of times, or sometimes, we think we know what the customer wants, and they come back and they really surprise us
Something totally.
with something. But how do you know if you haven't asked them?
Yeah, well, so I guess what we support a lot of the big agriculture, food processing plants in the area. And like, do we get this part back ordered a lot? Right, and if I ask them, hey, what can we do for you? And they could say, you could have more of that part made, so we're not back ordering it so much. That's already in my data, right? Yeah, anyways, that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah. Well, again, the important part is to, consider where you're at in some of these questions. And this is just the one component of revenue generation. There might be others. Is anybody in the group here struggling with something in revenue generation, whether it be sales, marketing, advertising, customer service, anybody going through a challenge right now in that category? Okay. All right, let's take a look at the next one. This was in operations, so these are different questions that you can ask within your group, and I would encourage you, if you've got a team, that you as a whole team kind of walk through some of these to just identify where you're strong at or potentially weak at there relative to operations. Do you have a clear way to identify customer expectations, metrics in place for continuous improvement, job and process costs being monitored against the plan? We won't read through all the individual questions there, but as you can see, there's an opportunity for identifying how well your organization is doing in some of these different questions. Again, it's trying to tease out where there might be some opportunities for improvement.
And I just think the second one from the bottom is worth teasing out, because I think in small organizations in particular, we tend to do things real non-standard because there's just one or two of us doing them. But if you're in a situation where you're growing and pretty soon there are 3 or 5 or 7, if you don't have a way of codifying those policies and procedures and then onboarding folks. I think as organizations grow, they get in trouble pretty fast.
Yeah. Okay, let's take a look at another category here, organizational development side. And again, it's looking at a couple of different categories of, do you even have a plan in place? And the other axis there is, well, how well are we doing in executing those? Number of, again, key questions that you might ask about, well, how are we doing in this one particular area? Again, these are trying to draw out where your gaps are at. And a lot of times in your strategic planning process and monitoring KPIs, that's what's driving it. It's not just to track the metric. It's to identify where a gap might be in the organization and what do we have to do to fill that. And KPI just becomes the measure for that. But again, which ones and are we doing the right ones would be that category here. And then last item here is, financial management. Some areas of, how well are we doing in some different categories and questions there in terms of financial management and the same process of identifying where opportunities for improvement might be within the organization, which really should be driving the KPIs that you are tracking. Okay, where do you get the data at? How do you find out? Sometimes it's your business software and financial reports that you might be doing internally or from an outside firm as a CPA. I mentioned surveys before in terms of getting customer feedback. How many of you do some form of a customer survey now to get some indication of how satisfied they are with you? One over here, one, okay. Sometimes, okay, all right, it's a great discipline to get into. Jim, how often do you run a survey?
We do them a couple times a year.
Okay.
Student level, parent level, alumni level.
Yeah. So surveys are a great way to get that feedback. Our organization, even internally, we do a survey once a year for our clients and for our organization ourselves as well. And just asking a series of questions of, how are we doing in this area on a scale of 1 to 5 or whatever, and monitor that. And then we compare that to how we did last year and what's the biggest thing we ought to be working on this next year type of stuff. And it helps draw out that information. Website analytics, obviously, manual tracking be another way of being able to collect the data that you're comparing to. Talk a little bit about leading and lagging indicators. It's not a big deal, but it's helpful to understand what are the two. And leading are typically future items. They're usually helping to identify the activity of what it is that you're wanting to accomplish. And the lagging just means it's already done. You can't do anything about it. So for example, at the end of the month, when you figured out what your sales were and your profit was, that's a lagging indicator because the month is over, it's done, there's nothing you can do to change it. But you might be able to do make adjustments with leading indicators. So with some examples, you might have an objective for weight loss, just a personal one. And a leading indicator, a leading KPI would be like measuring the daily caloric intake. That's something you can do every day or every week, and you can, monitor your progress, and that would be a leading KPI. The lagging one would be the weight. Whenever you decide to do it, at the end of the week, end of the month, whatever, that would be a lagging one. Once you've stepped on the scale, that's the number. Until next time. Okay, another one. We want to raise our outbound sales to 5,000 per month. One of the leading indicators might be how many outbound calls are we making. We found that, there's a correlation that the more outbound calls we have, the higher sales gets. And so tracking that one simple KPI may be one way to monitor that. And then what the actual sales were would be the lagging KPI on that. It's already, after the time that it's what's happened. But a lot of times you're able to project ahead of time, what the sales might be doing for the month. if you're tracking those leading indicators daily or even weekly, you have a pretty good idea of how you're coming along, and you still have time to do something about it. That's the critical value of a leading indicator. Another one there might be reducing the amount of waste that we have in production by some percentage. And one of the leading ones would be, well, let's just start tracking what are the reasons we have for waste. And you might find that there's 5 different categories in there that you have. Well, we have this happen, that happened, 5 different things that you've calculated, and then you start monitoring. Well, which is the biggest one? And a lot of times, most things fall in a Pareto chart or the old 80-20 rule. 80% of your problems are going to be caused by 20% of the reasons, type of thing. But those would be all examples of a leading indicator. And then the actual dollars amount that was wasted or that you had in scrap would be the lagging indicator. So the bottom line there, how do you know which one to use? Do you know what the activity is that will help you reach it? If you don't, then you're going to use a lagging indicator. And if you do know the activity, that is what you want to track to, have as your leading indicator to give you some advance.
And I think so an example in the education industry is, our lagging indicators are real clear, and they have been since about 2000 with No Child Left Behind. So it's all about reading achievement, math achievement. So I think we've been sort of enslaved by policy in education. And so oftentimes you'll see heavy investments in professional development. We're going to teach these teachers how to teach reading better. We're going to teach these teachers how to teach math better. So those become the objectives, and then the KPIs or the activities underneath that. And the reality is, how well adults get along in the schoolhouse has a heck of a lot more to do with how kids ultimately achieve than how much training we pump into people. So I think just checking formatively, we pick what we think are the right leading indicators that are going to lead your results. If the results aren't changing, we're probably not working with the right leading indicators.
Good point. Okay, so visibility, how do you display those? Well, a couple different reasons. You can have a performance dashboard that you might use. Just even regular email updates can be a good way to communicate how you're doing on goals. 40 years ago, I had a report that would come out each day to show me how many orders we took in the day before, how many we processed out, what our cash flow, cash levels were, how much our AR was, how much of it was behind, 60 days, different indicators like that we had tracked, and were all part of the objectives we had. But that was a daily sheet, that we had communicated to us. That was before we had, access to dashboards and that type of thing. Incident tracking, might be, a lot of manufacturers now put big boards up on the visual display of, tracking how much production is going out the door, or how much and many orders are coming in, different ways like that. But the important part is that it's visible somehow within your organization. If only a few people can see it, that's not nearly as good as getting most of the team, behind that objective or that type of thing. I remember the old Hawthorne effect type thing. Was an example of a company that was in manufacturing, and they were trying to figure out ways of how to improve the amount that they produced each month or each day. And so somebody came up with the idea on the first shift to write whatever number of products that they produced for that day. They put a big number on the floor and circled it. And, whatever the number was, 17. And the second shift came in and they asked, what's this number on the floor mean? And somebody told them, well, that was how many the first shift did the last time. And well, just knowing that the first shift did 17 motivated them to, we're going to do at least as good, if not better. And what happened was it started going back and forth, and they started talking amongst themselves of, well, gee, how did they go to 22, the next shift? And started asking and talking amongst themselves of, what can we do to to refine the process, and just the visualization of a number on the floor was creating questions on how in the world did they do that? And creating that opportunity for improvement. This is a sheet that I took off from EOS, and I know that was
That's our last
month-
topic.
that was last month's topic, so I thought, well, I'll do a little tie-in here from that.
Nice.
So this company scorecard is just a printed PDF. You can get it, download it yourself off the EOS website. But the idea behind that is what do we do with it now that we have KPI? And we're starting to track this. So what this company scorecard was a manual way of just showing, okay, here's the different departments or whatever, or different people, and these are the things that we're tracking. Here's our KPIs. And they listed them all down there, and then each time they had a meeting, they would just be updating them. And then what would happen was in their weekly management meetings, they would bring this sheet up and they would display it, or they'd hand it out to everybody, and they would identify if you're ahead of target, if you're on target, or if you're behind target. And if it was behind target, it was marked red. If you're ahead or on target, it would be green or yellow. And a very quick visual process of identifying, okay, we've got a KPI here that's in the red. What do we have to do to fix it? What are we going to do to change it, by next week? But it was a good way for just to take the KPIs and actually do something with them with your teams. And I thought I'd just share that as an example of what a simple way of tracking it would be. Now, what you don't need to do every week is to go through and read every single one and ask, where you're at. Identify the ones that are out of spec, talk about those, the other ones you keep moving forward with. And then this was kind of just an assessment page to have you think a little bit about, again, those different categories, and kind of identify in your own world of the quality, the utilization, the results, and the priorities. In other words, you go through each category and say, all right, do we even have a plan? Number one is we don't even have a plan, all the way to number 5. We've got a plan, we've got KPIs. Okay, that's good, but that's just that first column. The next column of utilization is you rank each category. Do we actually use it? Are we actually doing something with it? Are we referencing it? Are we executing it? Because that can be, a lot of times companies will come up with a strategic plan and then it kind of sits there and it doesn't do anything. And I'm sure you've all been a part of organizations where that's happened. The third category there, results, kind of going through the same thing again and identifying, all right, which one, we've got a plan, we're using it, but it really hasn't changed anything. Everything's, it gives you an indicator that, okay, something else is going on here that we haven't identified. And then the fourth one is, which of the categories are the ones we should be working on first? To help identify which of those categories might be the best ones to prioritize, because a lot of times you'll find a whole host of opportunities to work on, but if you don't prioritize them, chances are they'll still be there looking at you, next month, next year, that type of thing. So with that, Eric, anything else you want to add to that? And otherwise we can jump into questions.
Wow, spot on the timing. That's all I'll add. Happy to take your questions.
And one question is, someone in chat, Luann talks about having a scorecard, a dashboard, and a scoreboard. Any difference that you see in those two tools?
Well, answer that, or
You go first. How about that?
so the question was, is there a difference
Between a dashboard and a scorecard.
and a
So
scorecard?
she was referencing, they used to have one for operational measures, was the dashboard, all about consistency. And the scorecard was about improvement focused towards the strategic measures, which sounds pretty cool.
Yeah, it from my perspective, they're both communication forms, to, get the information out. I personally like dashboards because of the ability to put them on everybody's screen and they're readily available whenever you want to see them.
Yes.
But there's no reason why you couldn't have either or both. I would say a scorecard is typically used more in a manual type presentation or where you're passing them out reports or that type of thing. But the important part is, are you getting it communicated to your team?
Yes. Easily visible.
Easily visible, right? And to make it as easy for you to handle that as you can. I mean, one thing you don't want to have is a system that just requires a lot of labor to maintain
Right.
and keep, and update it. So,
Yeah, who does update it? That's a great question. Is it everybody's job to update, or is it one person's job to
Yeah.
culminate data? That's a
yeah.
good question. Have you
Yeah,
seen some?
that's a great question. Who is responsible for it? Well, it really depends on your organization and how you run and choose things. And again, there's no right answer per se. This is probably what's most effective. I would say though, that every KPI should have an owner. That somebody is responsible, and it's not a committee. You have
That's
one
good.
person who's their job is to produce the desired effect, that you want on it. So they always have somebody that owns it as well, as opposed to just, it's a company objective. Now.
If everyone's responsible, everyone's responsible.
Yeah, right.
Good one.
And I would add, I'm partial to dashboards in part because we build them, but I think, go ahead.
What is the dashboard? I have to ask.
So I think the easiest way to explain it is, if you're driving and you look at your car, as you're driving along and the indicator lights come on and the speedometer, keeps track of how fast you're going. That's basically your car's dashboard. So a company dashboard might be tied to your key performance indicators. So those key metrics that you want people to know about. And we build them sort of in a cascading way. So we want school boards and community to be focused on kind of the 30,000 foot view, right? So we want them to be looking at high level results, because a school board's job is to hold the superintendent accountable. School boards only have one employee. Some school board members don't believe that, but they only have one employee. It's the superintendent. And so they look at the high level results to tell the superintendent where he or she needs to be focusing their work. Then you can build dashboards so that principals are seeing a different level of data. Teachers then are seeing a different level of data. So everybody's tied into the same strategy, but the way that you're looking at those key performance indicators, those metrics are different. If I'm a second grade teacher, I'm going to be looking at reading data much differently than what we would want the school board to be looking at reading data, if that makes sense. And I think the best analogy for me is your car's got a dashboard. Does your company have a dashboard? Some of the other things, who designs them, who owns them, and what's their purpose? And should everybody be looking at the same level of data? And I tend to generally think not.
I would agree with that at different areas within the company, you drill down to a greater level of detail. And the more you're at the leadership deciding areas, you'll be looking at data that would be more cumulative and summarized. And then if you needed to drill down, you'd have that down to a more the operational frontline level type of thing. But that's good point.
Question on
Gordon?
Yeah, do you have a program that you recommend for creating the dashboards? I know that's something I struggle with because I'm very visual. I love dashboards. I run the chamber and we provide some graphs that are essentially our dashboards to our board for certain things that we're tracking, but I really struggle with like how to create one. I mean, mine are pretty, like I do them in like graphs on Word and use an Excel spreadsheet, but they're not very pretty. So like, is there a program? Is there something you could, like an app you could purchase or some kind of software that is reasonably priced that you could get to build the dashboards?
I can mention one, but I know
you go
you're
first.
in that world as well.
Yeah.
Okay,
I love a company called Online Strategy.
okay,
And I think it's onlinestrategy.com, or I'm sure if you can Google it, you can find it. But I love their approach because they do exactly what we've talked about here today. They help you work through your mission, vision, values, your overall strategic plan, and then when it gets down to the KPIs, then you build those as well that feed into it. But it's a great visual, and it's great for organizations that have multiple levels and departments and sub-departments and that kind of thing. So it's really scalable, and it's all basically online, and you have access to it that way. But yeah, that's one.
We use Tableau. We have a Tableau developer. Tableau is not a cheap product, but there are developers that will build them for you, maintain them. And that's generally a fairly inexpensive route.
Because like we track the chamber, we have, I mean, it's very old fashioned, but we have an Excel spreadsheet and we have all these tabs. So like Austin puts his metrics for marketing and communications, like how many Facebook likes we have, or if we did press releases, and then Elizabeth tracks membership, new members, dropped members, money and for memberships, and we track, how many people attend Ask the Experts and things like that. But to take all this stuff and then put it in something you can actually look at that means something is really difficult. Like we have all this data we collect, but it's in an Excel spreadsheet.
EOS, who you had the experts last month, they also have a couple different softwares that they are third-party companies that have built software for them.
Okay.
And they all pretty much do the same thing, but it's another resource to utilize, especially if you're using the EOS system for methodology. Which, by the way, I would highly recommend. I love it. So.
Yeah. Jason on Zoom said VMSG is relatively inexpensive, highly configurable along with report writing. VMSG. VMSG, yeah. Haven't heard of that one. Question, a lot of our staff struggle with using technology. So we usually end up printing everything or maybe putting it up on a dry erase board. Do you have any suggestions for this?
Training in technology. At some point, yes, you have to kind of use with what, your culture, team culture is and that type of thing. I'm a very adamant individual of I don't like to duplicate data. So write it, store it, record it once in one program, and hopefully you have the right program that keeps you from having to, well, we put it over here and then we put it on this over here and dry erase board, I guess, that we're constantly writing. But I understand, I mean, the technology side can be a challenge, but I really would encourage, that just means you have to do a lot more training.
Yep.
Because it's not gonna get easier.
Yes.
It'll only get harder, and that whole write it once saves you from a lot of transposition errors. You get those types of things where somebody's copying the information to a different report, and it's an opportunity to make a mistake. And so ideally, if you can do it once and no duplicate data, you're going to be the safest.
And a well-designed dashboard can be generally accessed by a mouse click, or at least a mouse click by each of your strategic areas or KPI areas. So it's wouldn't require a whole lot to scale up to learn how to move through it.
Is the staff meeting the best place to report on KPIs? Or as I sort of finish this person's question, is one-to-one's the best place for that, for each individual? Can you tell us more about where's the best place for that accountability to end up?
Well, I guess I would depend on the KPI itself. If it were a personal development or leadership development type KPI, that would make a lot more sense to have, one-on-one and that type of thing. If it's a departmental and anything above, definitely would be, a broader meeting type perspective. It doesn't always have to be a meeting. In fact, meetings are really meant to discuss and make decisions and issues. It should not be just passing information. You know, the dashboard does the information part. The meeting is actually to discuss, hey, one of these is out of whack, and what are we gonna be doing about it? Needs to be, or what's causing the problem, or, you know, drilling down a little bit further that way, as opposed to, it should not be for reporting the information itself.
That's so good.
When I think in the context of continuous improvement, you know, if you look back at Tom's slide 18, that priority rank. When I'm working with folks, I suggest, you know, you need to save your energy for those one-on-one conversations around that issue in your organization that is most critical or most urgent. That's where you need to be collecting that individual feedback. You certainly don't have time to have, no one has the time resource to have one-on-one conversations around every aspect of your business strategy, but we don't have time not to have one-on-one conversations when we're really trying to get to root causal analysis, and then what do we do next?
Would you put someone on a performance improvement plan for not achieving KPIs regularly? Here's a good one.
Great question, and I think there's two answers. And I think the first answer, and we often jump to the second answer, because the easy answer is yes, why would you not? I think the better question to ask is really a root causal question around, have we created the conditions in this organization where a person would have the reasonable opportunity to succeed time over time over time? One way you don't know is if you guess wrong, and the answer is yes, I'm gonna put that person on a plan. We start cycling through people, and I've worked in both large and small organizations, and in large organizations, you know, I was the one that tried to ask the question at some political risk, because, you know, everything is political, but we've had 6 different people in that job in the last 10 years, and none of them have succeeded. Did we really hire 6 losers? Or is there maybe something deeper going on in the organization that's not setting people up to achieve success? And I think we don't, it's a harder question to answer, but it's the more critical question to answer.
Yeah, I would agree that a KPI by itself would not be a reason for a performance improvement plan. Certainly without identifying what are the underlying issues that are causing it. And that might trigger something.
Yeah.
But not the KPI by itself.
If absenteeism is the primary reason why you're not hitting the KPI, that's a different deal.
Other questions?
I don't have a question, but I have a comment. I really appreciated slides 7 and 8. Those are really helpful, kind of like the ways of identifying getting to the KPI. That's just really helpful to me because just in my experience, I've gone about it backwards and I tried to tie meaning to it, and it just seemed like I was just kind of like running in circles. So I really appreciate that. It's really helpful.
I totally agree. And again, this is Tom's work, but slides 8, 9, and 18, in my opinion, were worth the price of admission.
Well, I didn't know we could talk out loud, so I'm sitting here texting.
Thank you.
I'm Caleb.
You can go ahead.
You know how hard that is to write that. Like,
Maybe I should read it
like,
just.
that made it so much easier. Well, heads up, you know, text Paul, man, I have to text Paul. So my question regards, so when you have a large organization, you have different verticals and departments. As you're integrating these different verticals that all have their own objectives, how do you set overall KPIs to manage a project? So I'll give you an example. So we do energy projects like where we're doing energy retrofits right now in the building, modernization programs, but we have 4 or 5 different departments all aligned, and each of those departments have their own staff and their own KPIs and their objectives. What's a good way to establish within the framework of that team overarching KPIs? So how do we holistically work together to hit these, to make sure that we're, as a project, we're hitting these KPIs, not just individuals? And I brought this up before, internally as, hey, if one gains and knocks one back, it's a net zero sum. You know, how do we benchmark this so we all show up to the best of our capabilities, performing our objectives for departments?
Yeah, I
See
think,
how hard that is,
I
right?
think, yes.
Like you're small. Yeah, thanks a lot.
I think it's very related to her comment, that if you try to do it from the bottom up, it's a lot harder.
Yeah.
You know, that you really want to think about your overall strategy and objective, you know, what's the objective for, you said you 4 different areas. Okay, so the first question I would have is, what is something all 4 areas are striving to accomplish, you know, in this next time period? And what their activities are should be feeding into that, maybe in their respective activities, but they're feeding into a common theme or goal at the top, as opposed to, we all have, otherwise you could have 4 things going, all doing very well, but in 4 different directions, that ultimately pull each other apart. And if you're not careful with that, and which often happens, I used to say, within our organization that we might have, you know, 5 different departments, but if they're going in 5 different angles, we're not going to have anything at the end of that time period. So that's why I think it's critical to define those objectives, you know, that critical annual primary objective, you know, that's one of the first things. And then what do the 4, in your case, what do the 4 different areas have to do in order to feed into that? And what are they potentially doing that is going to restrict the other side or that type of thing? In the project management world, we can often refer to that as bringing in the other stakeholders. I'll give you a great example. We were doing a dryer in a food processing plant. Decent sized project. We're gonna put this whole new dryer in. We had to do it, you know, in the middle of, you know, production is still going on. There would be ways of how we would time and do that. And one of the things we hadn't learned very well is identifying who are the people who are going to be affected by this. That's the other stakeholders in this project. Now, typically you would think of the, you know, the people in operations that way, the guys who are running the dryers, or the people who are the people that are feeding into the product into it and the product that's coming out, you know, those people. But there were other people that oftentimes, you know, weren't getting asked, and to step back and think, okay, who else is going to be affected by this? Like, oh, somebody in personnel needs to know what we're doing here because it's going to require some overtime or whatever. And they hadn't even thought to bring that person into the conversation. But here was the kicker. They had this project, you put in the dryer, and they're getting everything going, and nobody thought to contact the fire department. And so the dryer goes in, everything's running, and fire department shows up because they heard about the project, you know, somehow, and says, you know, you're missing this, this, and this, and this, and that has to be a part of it. And it was all legitimate, logical things, but nobody thought to ask, you know, the fire department to come in and take a look. And it totally disrupted the timing of the project, getting it completed, the cost of it. And it was just because they didn't think about who are the other stakeholders that need to, you know, that need to be a part of that. And that takes, you know, practice and learning, but it does make you remember or think about, let's not forget some of the ones that may not be so obvious, you know, as part of this project.
And I think 2 things, thinking about one of the last large school districts I worked in, I won't betray which one, but, and I think it's kind of the same across the board of, if, you know, if our ultimate lagging indicators are reading and math achievement by policy, that's really where we're judged in schools. You know, you have all kinds of different siloed organizations in large school systems. I mean, I was just smiling here. Like that's a dilemma that crosses industries, for sure.
But you guys have the answer.
Well, a couple of ideas. So we went through a process in one organization where it was really led by the folks that worked in the fiscal arena. We're saying we really need to tie every expenditure we can to, I mean, you've got expenditures in schools, you have to maintain physical plants. It's hard to really tie that to reading achievement, except for if you don't have, you know, good, safe, warm places for kids to learn, they won't learn as well. So really looking at every dollar expended, going through the filter first of, is this going to help us hit our objective? And then I think another thing that's often misplayed, I think merit pay in education is a terrible idea. We hear it all the time, but really what that creates is competition and who gets into what classroom, and there's politics behind it. But incentivization for collective performance is not a bad idea. So if we've identified what the key objectives or outcomes are for a clean project with the client, and we're all incentivized in some way, financial or otherwise, to work together to meet that objective. Department heads who don't see other departments' work as relevant, if there's a 10% pay bump or a couple of paid days off or some other incentive at the end of the rainbow for hitting those targets, we'll probably all of a sudden start communicating.
I like that. So follow-up question to my first question. When establishing groups like this, I found that you get information overload. You get too many KPIs, you get too much of this, and it becomes too cumbersome to actually track and manage, and it's conflicting and yada, yada. Do you have, so for these, is it KISS, like, do you have one primary and just keep a few specifics? Or what are your recommendations on that to try to keep it within reason? So I'll shut up after this, I promise.
No, there's great questions, because you can get into that side of it. So this is where I would, from my vantage point, would be if you're starting at the bottom and laying out all your KPIs and then trying to build it up, you can easily run it.
That's what, so you're going to top-down strategy.
You figure out,
Initial
okay, which are
personnel,
the critical,
identify.
that's what the critical KPIs, as opposed to just metrics and lots of, information. It's like flying a jet airline. They got a lot of things there that they could look at, but there's a couple critical, things that you're taught right away. What's my altitude? What's my pitch? And, angle of attack and a couple of those things. And then everything else is there if I need it, but it's not what I focus on.
Can you formulate through a SWOT structure when you're looking at it?
And I think, I absolutely agree with everything Tom said, and I think that when you think about the through line, and I'll use the school district analogy because it's easiest for me, and most aren't organized this way. And oftentimes when you're putting a strategic process together, it's political as well, even if you're not, even if you're in the private sector with 10 employees, you might put a plan together, I work for you, and I think, gosh, there's not of those 5 things, there's not one that speaks to me. If I were in charge of the business today, I would be working on these other things. So I think it is a fine line between how do you gather a massive amount of stakeholder input and then winnow that input into, and I think it's a series of sessions and meetings and what themes are we identifying, but some kind of process so that everybody's heard. And then when we get to those 3 to 5, and I think 5 is a lot, the 3 to 5 indicators, those key, your key strategic North Stars, everybody feels like they're at least heard and they're invested in the process and they understand why maybe their idea that they thought was the greatest idea since sliced bread at the beginning didn't work. And then I think it's really about a through line, right? So you've got your 3 to 5 big, broad strategic pieces. Underneath that with the tactics, the strategies, the tactics and the metrics. I'm a big believer in about you write a 5-year plan so your big goals don't change all that much. You're constantly adjusting those strategies, tactics, and metrics. And if you think about a school district, a school board might have a 1-page strategic plan. A school improvement plan is going to be speaking to those key 3 to 5 strategies. And there's going to be a lot more detail in that plan. At the teacher level, the lesson plans are going to be very discrete. But if it's done well, every single teacher should be able to say, I understand what that, and I think Pasco School District, I don't work there, so I'm not getting any sort of residual or press. I think Pasco School District does an absolutely incredible job of, you go down the hall and ask any teacher, what are our 5 outrageous outcomes in Pasco, and just about every teacher, 1,100 in the unit, 24 different schools can tell you what they are. Many principals can tell you how their school improvement plan actually feeds the district improvement plan. And then that becomes sort of the resource delivery mechanism to ensure that your teachers at the ground level are supported. So I think it's really, how do you take a political process, get lots of input, come up with just a few key laser-like things. The activities change out year over year because you're either, making progress like you would like, or you're not, and processes for that. And I think that also is a big piece of a strategic plan. Oftentimes, and Tom and I were laughing because half the businesses and half the education entities in the world don't even have them, but the half that do, half of them don't use them, and then maybe 25% of folks do. So, making sure that thing is a living document, it's constantly adjusted. And I think that's where the metrics underneath really help us. Like, wow, we're hitting all of this stuff. There's is there anything that we want to adjust for the next year? Well, you don't have to make it more difficult than it is. During my time in Pasco, we actually decided we had 5 outrageous outcomes and 4 of the outcomes were spot on, but the 5th one wasn't. And oftentimes what happens when there's superintendent transitions, and probably the same in business, is, you know, the new guy or gal rides into town and all of a sudden they want their own plan. So it was really refreshing toward the end of my career to say, we are spot on with these 4. This 5th one is where, again, we're going to engage lots of stakeholder input and there's room to negotiate because we don't think we hit the target with one of our big strategic indicators. So that was a lot probably to think about, but I really think it comes down to stakeholder input, identifying what we think are the right things, and then what's the through line to the person who's actually doing the most productive work kind of at the pyramid, at the base of the pyramid in the organization.
Would you tie your employee and customer surveys to KPIs? That'd be a good idea.
Yes.
Instead of just the standard survey questions.
Well, to answer it specifically, yes, even in culture, you know, when we are recommending that companies will do an employee survey on an annual basis on cultural questions, and even if it's a scale of 1 to 5, you know, one of the questions I do something called a 360 executive team interview, and we ask questions about the CEO to the executive team. And one of the things we'll ask them, on a scale of 1 to 5, how likely are you to recommend your friend come work for your organization? And we get some good answers, interesting answers. They're not always 5s. And so there's a metric right there of just that one question that you can ask that way. But yes, if you're you know, I had one of the slides in initially was what gets measured gets changed and gets acted on. And if you're not measuring it, chances are it's kind of like a baseball game and nobody's keeping score. Not nearly as interesting. You mentioned the NCAA basketball tournaments, nobody's keeping score. I don't think.
There'll be no
You
sports.
just have to have a tournament. Who would advance?
Yeah, exactly.
Leading and lagging. So KPIs, do you advocate to put KPIs in one or the other more? What would you say? So you're leading and lagging that you brought up.
I don't know that I would say one more than the other than to say, I'd like to have the leading indicators as making sure that I have leading indicators as often as we can. Not everyone may lend itself to it, but a leading indicator means you still got time to fix it.
Yep.
To me. And so I tend to want to make sure that I've got as many as I can that would help me, you know, drive that. So for example, we're talking about outbound sales and how do you raise that? And I had number of calls. Well, that might be one, but the length of the call might be another metric. You know, the average call time is 2 minutes. And I have one salesperson whose average call time is 10 seconds. That probably would tell me something. That would be a leading indicator that maybe there needs to be some other action going on. Maybe another one is well, obviously tying sales to an outbound call or something like that would be a lagging one. But again, the idea behind the leading one is it helps us determine the activities needed to be able to have success.
Yeah, behaviors. Yeah.
Behavior, yeah, and the ability to make adjustments if needed.
So good. Other questions? Who hasn't asked one yet? Let's thank our experts today. And how can they best contact both of you if they wanted to follow? Looks like Eric, you got your cards.
I brought cards.
Okay,
I have some cards as well.
okay, great. Grab a card from them before you leave, and we'll put that in the for you on Zoom. We'll definitely give you the contact information. We're gonna send you the slides if you were here today, either on Zoom or in the room. We also again want to thank STCU for sponsoring Ask the Experts, making it free to participate. Appreciate you, yeah, give me a hand. Would you please do us a favor and fill out the survey? If you're here in the room before you leave, you can just leave it and flip it over. If you are on Zoom, you can scan the QR code and fill that out. That would be fantastic because we want you to come back again and we want you to tell your business colleagues to join us. So we want to keep refining this and making it even better. I've also left a tool in the back for you, which is 10 tips for goal setting to greatness for your Q2, for setting some great goals. If you want to pick up one of those, or again, we will send that to you on Zoom. You see the next one, we got a flyer for this. Our next Ask the Experts is always the fourth Tuesday of the month from 3 to 4:30. And you'll see our next one is April 25th from 3 to 4:30, both live and on Zoom. And you see our topic is a good one, is now a good time to share some feedback. Okay, probably the reason why I still have a job is there will always be conflict in business with some staff member on your team or a customer. And this is going to give you some really good tools for having that difficult conversation with someone on your team and do it in a constructive, respectful way. So you don't want to miss that one. Bring your whole team with. We'd love to see them here. And that will be again on April 25th. Hope you'll join us again. So thanks for joining us today and hope your business continues to prosper as you go into Q2.